I've got a new song coming out. I know. It's been forever. I'm excited as hell for this, though. It's called Darling. It's coming out on Underdog Records December 16th, 2020. You can pre-save it now. If you're watching it after December 16th, there will be a link for you to find it, stream it in the description below. And, of course, I'm going to do this full track breakdown video, which might seem like a lot. We got a lot to cover here. But first things first, subscribe to my YouTube, follow me on SoundCloud, follow me on Twitter, follow me wherever. I'm going to have links in the description below for all that stuff. And let's get started, because this track is, oh my god, there's a lot going on. And I really, really, really want to cover it, mostly because I feel like there's a lot of cool stuff I discovered, and I feel like that information can help you guys a lot. If you're a musician or just in general an artist, I think some of these concepts, I'm pulling a lot of concepts in the song from different art forms, film, whatever, painting, all that shit. Let's start with the track Inception. First thing I did when I was beginning to write this song, let me remember real quick. Okay, yeah. I took a couple of pop songs, like random pop songs. I rendered them together and I loaded them into a sampler. And then I just started turning knobs on the sampler. And I was recording that whole session. And the pop songs were not in key with each other. They were not anything. It was just, honestly, I was just trying to generate signal and give myself an idea. And one of the little excerpts from that session that I did, that whole recording session, was this right here. And that little bit, that little melody, that little singing tone or whatever, that is the beginning of this whole song. And when you're playing through the whole song, you can't exactly hear it, but the foundation of it remains. And it's really interesting. It's really interesting because you can take this in a couple different ways. You can harmonize this in a couple different ways. Well, as with most things. And how I chose to approach it was I started with, I believe, some bells. Let's see if I can find those. Here we go. Bells stem. Okay. This was the first addition of harmony or doubling or layering that I did to the original melody that came from that sampler session. And that, to me, that sings. That says something. That's like a statement. That's like, this is happening. This is the beginning of something. And that sort of statement on top of the glitch melody here, it's asking a question. It's asking for a response. So I decided to go with a sort of call and response structure for the main portion of this song. Let's go ahead and listen to those two layers together. It's magical. Honestly, it sounds really good. And I'm surprised I was able to get that one. It was a huge session. It was like an hour-long recording, and I managed to get like one or two little clips out of that hour-long recording that sounded really cool, and that was one of them for sure. And next, I layer it with this instrument that I made. And this is a really fantastic instrument. It's a combination. I call it the forest lead, because it reminds me like some fucking like elves in a forest or some shit. Like some, like some magic fairies or some sparkle nymph. I don't know. Anyway, I call it the forest lead. It's a combination of a few different instruments, some hardware, some sampler-based instruments. Let's go ahead and listen to it, and I'll let you know how it's made. So, the most important part of this instrument is the kalimba. It's a hand piano, and it's just the most important part of this instrument. You can't really have this instrument without a hand piano. It carries the body of it. That's where the tone is coming from. And the rest of it is mostly like transient material, some sparkly stuff happening. There's I think there's a harp, but it's really, really, really subdued in this. It might come up more later on, the harp layer, because these layers are very dynamic in nature. I have them moving, like automating in and out based off of the phrase that they're playing in. And for this initial call phrase, it's very heavy on the kalimba. And let's go ahead and listen to those first three sounds together and hear how that, what it's sort of saying to us. It's really cool, honestly. It's really cool. And so that's the main idea of the song. That's where it all started from. And then after that, I picked up some drums samples that I was using in another project, and I brought them into this project. And just to get an idea going, I made the main beat of the song, which is, it's this kick, this snare. Let's hear it. Yeah. Is that the main beat of the song? Yeah, I guess it is. Huh. Crazy. Yeah, that's it. The snare is a snare that I made, really important to get that sort of like high tone is you get a snare sometimes and the body's really like thuddy, or it's like really like 200 hertz heavy. And oftentimes to sort of fit your drums into your song, I like putting a frequency shifter on it and then just like moving the frequency shifter around until that drum sits really, really nice in the context of your whole song. And that's what I did with the snare, is I moved a frequency shifter around, and eventually we got this sort of, it's kind of cool. It's like a 500 hertz sort of crack snare. And it sounds really nice. Let's see how it looks on a Spectrum Analyzer. Yeah, it's right around 550 hertz, 535 hertz. And it just kind of cuts through the song really nice. And the kick, again, this was not the original kick I used when I made the song, but something you're going to want to be able to do is write your kicks or write your kick pattern in MIDI. And that way you can swap the sample out and just have a sample that fits at the end. And here you can even see I've labeled it kick maybe. So I still wasn't even sure about this kick sample, but this kick sample was the one that fit the best. And I've got it running through Camel Fat, which is discontinued, but I'm sure you guys can find it online. You're resourceful. And it's just a little bit of compression. There's not much going on. When you have the right kick sample, you don't really need to do much. You can EQ out a bit if you want. I didn't. And wait, let me see if I processed it. Oh, I did. I clipped it a bit. A little bit of bit crushing. That might just be drive, honestly. Yeah, it is. It's just drive. It's not even bit crushing it. So yeah, there's not really much going on this kick. I guess there's an EQ taking out some 200 hertz. That was probably just making room for the bass, because I think the bass is pretty 200 heavy. But that got rendered down into the main kick pattern here. And the kick and the snare are also going to a really short reverb, a short plate reverb, I should say. And this reverb it's pretty imperative to have on your drums to make them sound like they're not just dry as hell, like to make them sound like they're actually recorded in a space. Let's see. Yeah, it just gives it that little bit of, you know what I'm saying. A little bit of breath afterward, a little bit of, oh, that's a real sound, instead of, wow, you just dragged in some samples. You get the idea. And then on top of that, it took me a little while to get the rest of the drums right, and ended up going with this loop I found. Honestly, it's just a loop. Let's listen to it. Now, I've edited this loop a bit, and I've added a few little percussion samples to it. And I also, the original one was like a house loop, and I think I slowed it down a lot to make it fit with the song. Because as you can see, the song's at 140 beats per minute. But from house music, if you're slowing it down to halftime, you got to slow it down to 70 beats per minute or whatever. And I have this running through Trash, which I think is just saturating it. Yeah, we got tape saturation to make it sound a little bit more warm, a little bit more real. I filtered it quite heavily to make it fit with the song, and the saturation just kind of like blends it back into the song. When you filter stuff too much, you can kind of get this removed or like distant sound. And then if you saturate or like add some compression to bring back some of those harmonics that you've lost through the filtering, it can kind of like, like smooth it back into your song. You'll hear the effects of that saturation in a bit when I play the whole drum loop. So let's solo the drums and listen to just those. And this is a really important part of dance music in general, is getting your drums right, especially in the main portion of your song. The rest of the song, it's kind of whatever, but during the main portion of your song, you got to get your drums right. So you got to be able to adapt your drums to your song, which I think is best done by having your kick drum in MIDI or having your snare drum in MIDI or whatever, and being able to swap out your samples. And then making sure your loops and stuff don't conflict with the rest of your piece. So this is a really cool drum loop because it adds a little bit of shuffle, adds a little bit of life to the song, a little bit of humanity. And I think there's a few other drums here and there. Not really, actually. That's pretty much it. There was a little bit of a snare that happens in the loop that I didn't really talk about, but it's not really much. There's just some, make sure your layers fit together. Your drums don't have to be too crazy or anything in dance music. You want to make sure your kick cuts through on a dance floor. You want to make sure your snare cracks through on a dance floor. But if your drums are too crazy, it's going to be really hard for people to dance to it. It's really be really hard for people to find that center, that rhythmic center. So try to keep them pretty simple in general, and do the complexities in your songwriting, and it will make a big difference. So let's hear that with the main the inception of the song, to kind of see where the starting part of the song, where it's at, So that's a really great call. It sings, it sounds really beautiful, it sounds emotive. The shuffle keeps some sort of life to the drums. And I think the most important thing is thematically it all sounds together. And once I got to this point, I was happy moving forward. I don't really like to move forward in a song until everything is right. Until every ingredient that's happening in the moment is right. If the ingredient is wrong, then you can't really move forward until that ingredient is correct. And the only exception to that being your main drums. I think you can cycle out your main drums at the end of the production process. When you have a finished song and you're like, man, this kick just isn't hitting right, swap out your kick, swap out your snare. That's the only exception to this. But if your melody is right, if your flow is right, if your feeling is right, then you can move forward with the rest of the song. And then after that, I believe I wrote the bass line, which is the next part of this. And this bass line took a lot of work because, well, I have a bunch of different iterations of it. Here you can see all these muted ones. The grayed out ones are muted ones. And I liked a lot of different parts from each of the different bass lines. So I ended up comping like a lot of them together. I ended up like picking the parts I like. I even you can see I faded in certain aspects of it, and it adds a really cool texture. I'm going to go ahead and solo this bass line here and play it for you, and you can hear what is kind of happening. Now the different parts to this bass line is there's a sub bass, which is like an 808 that I had made using, I believe, Massive and then UVI Falcon. And this bass down here is sort of the mid lead bass, and this is the one that kind of sings the harmonies. And this is it's almost a chord because they're playing, each layer of it is playing a different note, and it sort of interacts with the main lead. I mean, it happens at the same time as it, but it's still a call and response sort of deal. Let's go ahead and play it. So this is really important. That those harmonies in the bass are really important. Those harmonics, they really accent this sort of tension and idea from the original inception point of the song, which is these bells here. You get the idea. And let's go ahead and solo all those elements together and hear how they sound. It's important to note that no individual instrument is trying to do something that isn't its role. And this is a really important thing in music production in general. If you're trying to do something with a sound, like if you're trying to get your, like, that low end bass from a sound that doesn't really have a great low end bass fundamental, you're trying to make something do something that it's not designed to do, you know? And each one of these sounds is doing what it's designed to do. This lead bass sort of like warm sound is harmonizing stuff, and it's providing the response to the initial call. And this sub bass is providing the boom or 808 or whatever the fuck. Let me play that real quick. I wanna make sure I'm saying the right thing. Yeah, it's like a 808 type bass that I made. A lot of it is honestly just using the low pass filter in Massive and using the Bronner tube in Massive and a sine wave. And then you can tune like a harmonic if you really want to, but you don't really need it. You can just use the filter and like certain resonance, and then you can key track the resonance and you can get some cool little tones that way. Yeah, so each one of these things is doing its job. Like this bass, this sub bass is not trying to play those mids. It's filtered out in that sense. You can see here on this EQ, it's filtered out to about 400 hertz so that it doesn't conflict with the other stuff that's trying to do that job. And that's another thing for, I think, music production in general, is if you want a job done in your song, you have to pick the right tools or the right ingredients for it. I don't even know if this is even making sense, but hey, let's move forward. Let's move forward with the song. What else do we have in this initial section? I have this harp. This is part of the harp from the Forest lead, but it's like an effects tail that I had from a separate effects chain. I liked the way it fit in with the rest of the beat. I'm gonna solo it and play it for you guys. It sounds a little like this. Now I know that it's not really much, but it adds a lot to it. It does. It adds a lot. Let's hear that with the harp effects. So it's just like a little like it adds it like just like floating. How to say it? You get the idea. You hear what it adds. Now the next thing that happens in the response section, it is part of that session I was talking about earlier, the inception of the song. I got some more samples from that, and these are more vocal centered samples from that like massive pop song stack, and I have worked them into the response section of the song. So we've got the Forest sort of like bells and like glitchy like melody sort of thing happening, And then the response over the top of the bass line is these vocals here. And I'm going to solo them for you, and you can hear them. And those just have obviously singing quality. They just kind of sing the response. You have the instrument saying something, and then you have this sort of like not quite human sound singing something back. Because it's gone through like this granular process, these sampling processes, it's very it's very human in a sense, but not quite. Like, and that's where you want to be with electronic music. I think you want to be human, but not really. Like, you want to be tiptoeing that line, you know? And I think these vocals really captured that quality. Let's listen to all of it all together now, because I believe that's everything that's happening in the first portion of the song. Oops, system overload. Classic. Awesome. It sounds great. It sounds really cool. It works together. And that was the main idea. And I wrote this idea, and I'm like, man, this is really sick. This is really sick. Where do we go from here? And I write my songs from middle out, and I don't recommend this, really, because it makes your songwriting process take a lot longer. And this song in particular took me an exceptionally long period of time to really get it right. And I think part of the problem was writing what came before it. So let me go into that and talk about how the energy from the introduction and the pre-chorus, I'm going to call it a pre-chorus because, I mean, even though there isn't really words to this chorus, there's a vocal, and it is sort of a choral section. So the pre-chorus section, how that sort of and adds this anticipation, adds this tension to the main bass drop section. And I think I started the pre-chorus with this sound here called sluggish. It's exactly how it sounds. And it doesn't really say anything. It doesn't really do anything. It's just kind of a textural sound. And it didn't really help. It didn't really help. So what did I do that helped, that added something new, but created anticipation? And I think it was these sounds here. This is a violin. Yeah, it's a violin. It's pitched down a bit, but it's a violin. And that sound, it has the same pattern as the bass line, but it has these notes that are kind of like major key almost. They're kind of like hopeful. They're kind of like hopeful. Oh, this is really pleasant. And that's layered with, I believe, a pan flute that I made in Serum. And this pan flute, if you're looking to make something like this, the best thing I can recommend is do a lot of enveloping. Make sure you have the right noise sound, and make sure your harmonics are right on your synth. Those are the big three things. If you're trying to synthesize a flute, I didn't have to synthesize this flute. I could have used a number of presets, but hey, I like to make things more complicated. So this is sort of like a happy, like hopeful moment, like. Like, oh, that's really nice. That's really pleasant. And then when it gets into the other section, it's like, oh, that's not as pleasant. I don't know. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of dissonance and like minor intervals and chords that only exist in minor keys. And that sort of tension is released in the pre-chorus. And this is a sort of interesting way to approach songwriting, is have your release be in your pre-chorus and have your tension be in your chorus. But I think for electronic music, it works. It works a lot, especially because when it returns to this later on in the song, it's this sort of like really nice release from this tense, this like these 7 chords, these 9 chords, these 13 chords, whatever, that are happening in the drop. And it's like, oh man, I can breathe. And then it goes into the drop again, and you're just like, I don't know. I think having tension over the drop is really, really nice. It's just in electronic music especially. And let's see what else we added in. There's a few piano notes. For this piano, I used Logic's EXS24 Steinway Grand Piano, and I believe the reverb is Logic stock reverb. So if you're in Logic, it's a great piano. If you're in Ableton, you can actually load EXS libraries into Ableton Sampler. All you got to do is just drag the EXS file, whatever, into Ableton Sampler. So if you have access to the Steinway Grand Piano EXS file, you can load it into your Ableton and have the same exact piano. And it's a gorgeous piano. It sounds really good. And I like it right out of the box. And I use it a lot more later, and I'll show you that in a moment. But let's finish wrapping up the pre-chorus. Now, one of the most important things in electronic music is anticipation and delivery. So for one of the easiest ways to add or create anticipation is to tease something that's going to happen later. And what I did here for that is fairly simple. It's just I took an older render of the song with earlier samples, an earlier bass line, not quite exactly the same, and then I bandpass filtered it here. And that sort of brings you in. It brings you in from this sort of like flute piano, like spacious, there's no drums, there's no rhythmic elements, and then you start to hear the bandpass thing, like anticipation starts building up. And your head starts to bob. And I think that's the most important thing. Before a beat drop, you want to get people's head bobbing. You want to get them to sort of anticipate the flow of the beat drop in your electronic music. And what other elements do we have? We have the vocal hook. We have some reverse sounds, you know. This is part of the harp from the Forest lead. You know. Let's go to the vocal hook real quick. This is a vocal hook I found on... I'm not sure where I found it, but it's an old movie sample.
You really mustn't, darling.
And here what I've got is that darling word has some echoes on it. So it echoes into the drop. And the echoes play on the same rhythm that the bass happens. So it comes in and it lands right on the bass, and it sounds really cool. This is a bit of a reverse reverb to sort of like pull you into the vocal hook, because it does kind of happen out of nowhere. And then there's this reverse cymbal here that goes into a nice big airy clap right before the drop. Let's listen to that. And then this is a bit of a reverse explosion that pulls you right into the first kick drum. I think having little reverse sounds like this is really important, and it adds a lot to your song. It adds a lot of really cool depth. Altogether, this pre-drop sounds like this. So it's really interesting. You have the release of these like very major sounding chords in the pre-chorus, and then you have the tension in the bass drop, but you also have the tension in the pre-chorus, which is building up with like risers and like reverse effects and like bandpass stuff, and you have the release in the drop, which is like this heavy bass, this beat, you know, this really full sound. So you have these tension and release moving in or perpendicular motion, I think that creates a really cool effect. That's something that not a lot of electronic artists are doing, and I think they really should be doing it. It's a hallmark of great songs everywhere, and to have that sort of contrast, to have that sort of perpendicular motion. Now, as far as the rest of the intro goes, I have, just some very basic like pad effects. Nothing too crazy. These are just to sort of set the tone, set that sort of foresty, ethereal tone. And I believe I teased the forest lead as well. And let's find that. Here it is. Cool. Now let's get into the bridge. Let's get into the switch up of the song. And that happens in the second half of the drop. This is where the forest lead kind of has a solo. This is kind of hard to describe, but I wanted to write a really cool like melodic line with this that sort of sings something, because the vocals, they are very harmonic, they're very backing in nature, and I wanted to have a melody, like a really strong melody, and that happens after your first call and response section in the drop. This forest lead comes in here, like slowly filters in right here. That's the wrong one. Hold on. Let me find the right one. I believe the right one is... Here we go. Yes. This is it. Okay. This is the first melody that happens. So this melody is really important. It creates an alternate call and response that wants to bring you back to that resolved like major section in the pre-chorus, and it also creates something you can sort of sing along to, or something that gets stuck in your head, I guess. And in this portion of the forest lead, it focuses a lot more on this FM synth layer, and it also focuses a little bit more on the harp layer. So those two layers are more pronounced in this. And that's how it differentiates from the original call layer, which is more leaning on the kalimba. Then that has a little bit of delay, and it brings you right back into the pre-chorus. Now the pre-chorus is really similar the second time around. I mean, nothing wrong with a little bit of repetition. You set people up, but the second drop is where things start to get very, very, very different. And noticeably in the drums, in that there is none. There's no drums. And this is something that's like, it's pretty popular in rhythm or dubstep or those types of things, where they have a fake out drop. But this isn't just a fake out drop. This is just like there's no drums. And at first, when I showed it to people, there's like, where's the drums? But then you get the idea. You get the idea. Let's listen to it a bit, and then we'll go over the ideas and concepts behind this second drop.
You really mustn't, darling.
So the drums, they don't really work here, because this is like one of those moments, if you listen to trance music, if you listen to anything sort of really emotional, this is like one of those really emotional, like belting moments where it's just like really expressive, and drums don't add anything to expressive moments in music. They don't. It's just they're too transient nature. They're too punctual. They're too messy. They don't express anything. They define things. And so I think that it's really important to not have any drums here. The biggest thing that sticks out, obviously, is going to be this piano. And let's go ahead and listen to that. So there's a couple different layers to it. One of them is this one labeled Piano Dry, which is actually not the dry one, ironically enough. It's got delays, you know. And then this is the other layer to it, which is a more dry centered tone. And the reason I have these two layers is one of them is not super mono compatible. When you sum it down to mono, the signal sort of disappears. So I made a more central mono signal piano and layered the two together. It's something you can do if you're testing in mono and there's something that you really want to cut through in mono. Create a mono channel of it and then mix it in with your music and see how that goes. Next up, the second biggest change is probably in the bass. The bass line, from the intro, the response to it. Well, the call is still full volume. And then the response is super filtered out. And you can see here the different automations that have been done. You can see there's reverb being automated in and out. There's a filter being automated over this bass. And all of this is really to generate forms of expression and have this bass sort of move in this expressive moment. And this is sort of creating a push and pull feeling. All these automations, they're very deliberate. The reverb automation is to create that sort of like splashing like wave effect and distance, like something is moving further away from you. And then the filter, when it comes back in, when the high frequencies come back in, the reverb goes away in perpendicular motion again. And that sort of creates this like push and pull feeling to the bass line. I think that's really on theme with the rest of the song. The rest of the song is very perpendicular, it's very push and pull. Like this is what's happening, call and response almost, but it's like moving. It's like very fluid call and response. They interact with each other in real time. It's not like A, then B, then A, then B. It's like A and B like moving together, like dancing together. It's really important. Okay, yeah, so that's the bass line. Then what else do we have in this section? It's just that. It's just the piano. And then there's this uber wet piano stem, which is going through the Space Designer and Logic, I believe. And that's just to create this huge like feeling. And I think that's going through the preset Thunderclap, or it might be Mountain Echoes. I'm not really sure. But it's going through a preset in the Logic Reverb Space Designer. What is this? Oh yeah, so there's a little bit of a teaser of the drums here. And then it ends with the Forest lead kind of singing you this like millennial chorus type thing. What there's a word for this. It's hemiolic in nature, in that I believe it's like on 5 or 7 or something. And then that loops over the beat in a really interesting fashion. Last but not least, you've got some reverse effects, which are mostly just reverse cymbals, and they're really, really quiet. And that just kind of adds this sort of pulling feeling that pulls the beat forward. It's a really slow song. It's like a slow jam or whatever. So these reverse effects add a little bit of push. Let's see if I can solo them for you. And it's just different cymbals being reversed. There's not much to it. Altogether, that sort of forms this piece of music, and I'm really happy with it. I'm really happy with the way it came out. It took me a really long time to finish the song because naturally a lot of the instruments went through a lot of trial and error, honestly. And I really hope you guys learned something from this, or, at least enjoyed the content. And be sure to check out the song. Be sure to follow me on social media. Shout outs to Max, again, Protohype, for believing in this song and signing it to his record label. And thanks again for all your support, guys. You've been amazing. Peace out.